Stalin was a mighty man, and a mighty man was he. He led the Soviet people on the road to victory. All through the revolution, he fought at Lenin's side, and they made a combination till the day that Lenin died. He said, come on, you people, we must work with brain and hand. And then one day the Nazis came into the Soviet land. They plundered to the Volga, to Stalingrad. And then Joe Stalin said, come on, me boys, and kicked them out again. Oh, Stalin was a southerner, in Georgia he was born, where the oranges grow thick and fast and fields of waving corn. And Stalin is a farmer, his fingers they are green, and he has planted the biggest crop the world has ever seen. One day he looked upon the map and frowned and shook his head. There's too much brown and not enough green, these were the words he said. We'll have to change the weather, boys, he said, and then he smiled. So let's begin by planting trees along 3,000 miles. So Stalin rolled his sleeves up then and said it's time to start. The Volga River and the Don, they are too far apart. I think we'd better join them, so come and help me, pal, and we'll build a mighty waterway, the Volga-Don Canal. Then Stalin went into the north, and there saw rivers three, all emptying their waters into the polar sea. Now that's not right, Joe Stalin said, these rivers, they are ours. We'll turn them round and make them work and make electric power. There was a range of mountains that were standing in the way, so Stalin put his hand out and smoothed them all away. For Joe, he is determined to make the land all green, and that's the biggest project that the world has ever seen. Oh, Stalin is a mighty man, and he has a mighty plan. He's harnessed nature to the plow to work for the good of man. He's hammered out the future, the fortune he has seen, and he's made the worker state the best the world has ever seen.
Good evening, everybody, and welcome along. It is the evening of the 15th of December, 2024, and here we are today answering a couple of questions from viewers and listeners. And this is a pre-recorded show going out as a live, so if I'm not interacting with your questions in the comments, I do apologize. It's not a matter of rudeness, it's a matter of the fact that I am here but not here. So please bear with me. Normal live service will be resumed tomorrow. That is the Monday, 16th of December. So we will get straight into it. And questions, of course, at the moment, mainly relating to the Gaza crisis, the act of mass murder being carried out there by the US imperialists via the Zionist colony, and, of course, the situation in Syria. So we will get moving then with a question from Comrade Ben, who asks the following. Jonathan Cook claims that the reason the Zionist entity did not perpetrate a genocide against Palestinians, particularly in Gaza, earlier, is that international law was too strong at the time. So two questions arise that I would like help understanding. One, why hasn't the Zionist entity properly genocided Palestine earlier? Two, has any international law or institution ever restricted the operations of US imperialism in any way? So let's deal with the premise of the question first. I don't agree with Jonathan Cook's formulation. I mean, he's a good journalist and a good writer, but politically, he's somebody who still, I think, wants to believe that there is a system of international law. Well, there isn't. The system the imperialists built is a system where they write laws which are applied to somebody else. They are never applied to themselves. They are never meant to restrict the activities of the imperialists in any way. So as to whether what the Israeli regime's plan was with regard to Gaza, that's an interesting question. So To answer Ben's point here, why didn't they do this earlier, this mass slaughter and destruction? The answer is, of course, they didn't think that they were on that much of a tight schedule. The US imperialists were patting themselves on the back until September of, or even the day, I think it was like the day of the week before of October the 7th, the launch of Operation Al-Aqsa Flood. Like, there's the infamous comment from Jake Sullivan that the Middle East is as peaceful as it had been for many, many years until October the 7th occurred, of course. Now, what the imperialists were doing, and this was something that was entirely consistent, again, from Obama to Trump to Biden and back to Trump again now, was that they were pursuing a new strategy, which involved normalization deals being signed between various Arab comprador regimes and the Israeli regime. And this was really all about making sure that the Arab compradors were bound into a solid set of agreements with US imperialism via Israel, making sure that all of their regional puppet states were publicly on the same page with each other. And of course, facilitating whatever business the US imperialists had to conduct that would go from the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia through to the Mediterranean coast. Pipeline politics, part of this, which has been mentioned as part of the motivation involving Syria. But this was their strategy. And their strategy for dealing with the Palestinians, well, the overall strategy was that they wanted to annex the West Bank and then force out the Palestinian population, apart from some reliable comprador elements who would be allowed to stay, I think. But the focus of the Netanyahu regime was, prior to October last year, in carrying out the annexation of the West Bank bit by bit. They're still doing this, and they're doing it still with the collaboration of the Mahmoud Abbas-led Comprador Palestinian Authority. That's why the Palestinian Authority is besieging refugee camps and killing resistance fighters on behalf of US imperialism, who ultimately pay the PLA's bills. So what they were going to do was a more slow population expulsion than they're doing now. They planned to increase their control over the West Bank bit by bit, moving cautiously with the collaboration of the PLA to isolate more and more Palestinian areas and slowly expel the population, take them over, etc. The plan with Gaza was that they thought they had it firmly under control, and that once they'd completed their business in the West Bank, they could then turn to Gaza at their leisure and take care of it using the same methods. It would be more difficult than the West Bank in some respects, but they thought that because they had complete control over, or they thought, what went in and what went out of Gaza, they thought that they could essentially keep things there bottled up. They planned to, at least they thought they had a plan, to slowly bring the Hamas administration of Gaza round to, if not collaborating with them, then not actively resisting them. For instance, one thing Netanyahu was planning to do was to increase the amount of work permits that will be given to Gaza residents who wanted to go and work in the West Bank. So go work for Arab, or so we say, Palestinian capitalists or petty bourgeois, and make money that way. And that, they hoped, would, by bringing more money in with them, the Palestinian workers from Gaza would help to, via their remittances that they would share with people in Gaza, would help to keep the situation in Gaza calm, that by bargaining over the work permit situation with the Hamas administration via intermediaries, that they could essentially keep things under wraps there. They could keep things bottled up until they were ready to deal with the situation. They were also constantly looking for collaborators in the Hamas administration of Gaza. This turned out to be a disastrous miscalculation. But the reason why they didn't do this earlier was because they were always planning on this in the end, but they didn't want to proceed on this level of, shall we say, this level of dramatic escalation, which has damaged them internationally speaking, and has destabilized them internally. So the plan was always to do this, but the plan was to do it in different ways, to do it in ways where you wouldn't have a massive explosion in anti-Zionist sentiment in the West, where you wouldn't get further destabilization within Israel, where you wouldn't get the Yemenis running an effective blockade on Israel's Red Sea trade, where you wouldn't get another war with Hezbollah, which the Zionists were shown to be incapable of winning. The plan was to move much more slowly and to do it over a number of years, dealing with the West Bank first, because this is where the internal politics of Israel had led yet Netanyahu via his coalition partners, the openly fascist organizations led by Ben Gvir and Smotrich. So the plan was, as to reiterate my answer to Ben's first point, the plan was always population expulsion and population transfer. And the question, of course, was where were they going to send them to? My guess is, and again, this is guesswork, my guess is there would have been more bribes for the wretched comprador king of Jordan, maybe also for the Egyptian comprador regime as well, and elsewhere. They would have encouraged migration as much as they possibly could. They'd have encouraged mass migration out of the West Bank, out of Gaza. They'd have used every trick in the book that they've long had practice with to try and get as many Palestinians out. And then those who refused to go, many would be expelled. A few would stay, and there would be a few collaborators who would be rewarded at the end of the process. But the plan was, yes, they were going to do that, but they were going to do the expulsions and take over the land, but they would be doing it on a much slower pace, and pace that they would be more firmly in control of. Now, what Operation Al-Aqsa Flood forced them to do was it forced them out into the open in terms of the plans that they'd had for a long time. And also it forced them to act rashly and get themselves involved in very risky situations. Like the war with Hezbollah was a big risk. It was a one that they were meant to win and meant to win quite quickly via decapitation strikes, and it didn't work. So they've been twice exposed on October the 7th itself and by the war with Hezbollah as being nowhere near as powerful as they portrayed themselves to be. So they have now speeded up their process, again with the full collaboration of the Abbas regime. And now their aim is to do something with Gaza. My thought is that they aim to somehow get away with forcing the population into an even smaller area, like the far south of Gaza, right on the Egyptian border, or try to force them out entirely. They haven't got away with that so far because the population has refused to go. They will be thinking now that they have other options. So they may try to sign a deal with the more the collaborationist elements in the Qatar-based Hamas leadership, Meshal, etc., others who are still collaborating with the West, whereas the Gaza leadership, the Hania, and of course Yahya Sinwar, had moved into a much more radical national liberation position, whereas the Qatari-type leadership remained the shady bunch that they always were. And maybe US imperialism is thinking, well, now we've had the win in Syria, so maybe now we can force a deal with this Qatar-tied Hamas leadership. There's been repeated talks of some kind of bargain, but can Khaled Meshal actually deliver, given that he's a rather distant figure from the Hamas organization in Gaza? We don't know. But to reiterate the point, the October the 7th forced the Israelis to act more rashly and to take more risks that for a while looked like they really weren't going to pay off. Now the situation is less clear. The victory in Syria that the imperialists have achieved, even if it's a short to medium term one, does complicate the picture. Maybe the US imperialists will try to force a bargain in Gaza and say to the Israelis, look, we'll do a bargain in Gaza to calm the situation down. You go and take all the land that you want in southern Syria. Perhaps this is the bargain that's being made, and we'll do a deal where we force the PLA into Gaza with the collaboration of the more, shall we say, dodgy leadership of Hamas, the Qatari-based leadership. Maybe that's the plan. But to reiterate the answer to this question, the plan was always population expulsion, but the plan was to do it slower and on a much more subtle way. The October the 7th forced them to act in a much more directly brutal fashion, and as a consequence of which they've paid ultimately a heavy price for it. Now, this comes to Ben's other question, the second part of this, which is about international law. Has it ever restricted the operation of US imperialism in any way? Not in any meaningful way. I mean, the same is true of like international public opinion. Like now, like Israel is as a, to use the horrible corporate term, a brand, has been damaged internationally by all of this. Absolutely no doubt about that. In the short term, that doesn't necessarily matter to the US imperialists, because the way they're looking at it, well, they back Israel, and therefore that's the only vote that matters for now. It will make things more difficult for the Israeli regime going forward, because lots of things have been exposed by October the 7th. Many of their vulnerabilities have been exposed. Their vulnerability to the fact that a lot of their business in there and their economy is vulnerable to anti-merchant shipping operations in the Red Sea. The fact that their army is incapable of actually fighting a serious opponent. They're good at killing civilians. They're good at blowing up civilian targets, but they're not very good when it comes to actually fighting an organized, well-led, determined, and politically motivated foes like the resistance groups in Gaza, like Hezbollah in southern Lebanon. Their military failed twice, with all the firepower advantages that they had in both cases. They definitely came off the worse in the Lebanon war, and in Gaza they've been unable to uproot Hamas and the other resistance groups from their operation there. So the operations with regard to Israel, I mean, the international law has not constrained them, and international law doesn't constrain them, to go back to the question, because US imperialism stands behind them, and US imperialism is the only vote that really counts for the Israelis. It will do them much more damage in the medium to long term, though. So Operation Al-Aqsa Flood basically marked I would say, a key turning point for the Israeli regime. It revealed that so many things about it were fake. It revealed the huge weaknesses of its military and intelligence apparatus, and it revealed fundamentally that the case that communists have made for a long time, going back to the original campaign, the original platform of the PFLP, that this is a regime which is acting in the interest of imperialism and is dependent upon imperialism for its survival. That has been made crystal clear over the course of the last year. US imperialism has paid all the bills, they've provided all the weapons, they've underwritten the costs, and provided all the diplomatic cover that the Israeli regime needs to carry out its crimes. Without US imperialism's constant backing and constant bailing them out, the Israeli regime would have fallen. And there's no doubt about that. So the vulnerabilities of the regime have been thoroughly revealed, and that will cost them in the medium to long term, certainly, even if they obtain a victory in the short term, which is possible. It was always possible that they would, but medium to long term, this has damaged them in a terminal way. Now, back to the international law question. International law is a funny one, because the system of international law as we know it now comes from the period immediately after World War II, the founding of the United Nations, the implementation, the creation of the UN Charter, UN Declaration of Human Rights, etc., which was cooked up by some very shady individuals, including one of the architects of apartheid, certain General Jan Smuts, former opponent of the British Empire, later collaborator with it. Now, the UN system, which says a lot of very pleasing words to the liberal ear, was created to give the impression after World War II that lessons had been learned, that the evils of the Nazis, the evils of Hitlerite fascism, were so great that everybody was going to learn the lessons this time. There wouldn't be another, useless League of Nations that wouldn't do anything. That nations were now going to be bound by a system of rules and laws that they signed up to when they joined the United Nations, which has all these associated bodies like the World Court and international courts of justice, etc. And this was going to be the new way forward. You were going to have internationally enforced standards when it comes to human rights, when it comes to labor rights via the International Labor Organization. And this was the propaganda from the West, from the US imperialists and the British coming out of World War II, revealed immediately to be false. Before the ink was even dry on the founding documents of the United Nations, it was launched in 1943. The French imperialists in 1944 were committing horrific massacres in Algeria, like massacres which were committed with an even greater speed and brutality than the Israeli regime has managed in the last year. The Israeli regime, again, we don't know the full extent of the death toll as yet. It will probably be more than the estimates we've seen. The Israeli regime is calculated to have killed, well, anywhere from 44,000 to, well, some estimates say over 100,000. French imperialism killed 44,000 inside a month, I think, in Algeria in 1944. And that's with a lower level of technology. So that was done when the UN Charter was still relatively new, when all of these nations, including de Gaulle's France, were committing to all these new supposedly amazing laws or international standards about human rights and stuff. So when it comes to the interests, not just of the US imperialists, but they're the principal player here, but the powerful imperialist countries, all of it always meant exceedingly little. It didn't stop the British committing all their crimes in Kenya. It didn't stop the US waging war via a UN mandate that they had managed to achieve for the war of imperialist aggression against People's Korea. It didn't stop the British imperialists and the French imperialists trying to invade Egypt in 1956. What stopped that was the fact that the US imperialists, for their own reasons, didn't approve of the operation and threatened to pull the plug on the British economy. So it didn't stop the US imperialist intervention in Vietnam. It didn't stop the US imperialists killing Patrice Lumumba and allegedly from assassinating a UN Secretary General, if you believe that story, which I would say it's rather likely. It didn't stop any of the other moves that US imperialism has made. Now, does this mean that the international law is entirely useless? I think for constraining the activities of the most powerful imperialist nations, it is entirely useless. If the US wants to do something, if they really want to find a legal justification for it, they'll employ some lawyers to find one. They've not really bothered though with the war on Gaza. They've just bullshitted their way through that. They tried to find, of course, all kinds of legal justifications for what is quite obviously a neo-colonial situation they have created inside Ukraine and tried to turn international law against the Russians, only for Putin to throw it back in their faces again. But essentially, it has never constrained any US imperialist endeavor. What constrains imperialism, what really constrains it, is fear of having a defeat inflicted upon them, which does constrain them. Fear of the power of other peer competitor nations. So why hasn't the US just directly deployed its own men into Ukraine, for instance? That's a question that's been asked over and over again. And now they, of course, have deployed men undercover, as has the French state, as have the British, but not directly. They haven't openly deployed their forces into a direct fight with the Russian army, and that's through fear of the Russian armed forces, fear of the Russian response if this went south, which it would. So it's not international law that constrains imperialism; it's fear of what your opponent can do to you, or it's the ability, as the Vietnamese had, to inflict a military defeat on the US imperialists, which they did, or the ability of the Koreans with their Chinese and Soviet allies to at least fight the US imperialists and their coalition to a standstill in Korea. So it's force that decides. It's not lawyers in a court. The Zionists and their, by extension, US imperialism are going to be found guilty of all kinds of things by the International Court of Justice, or could even be found guilty by the the farcical International Criminal Court, which was a creation of imperialism. But it won't matter in the slightest, because who is going to go into Washington, D.C. and arrest the President of the United States? Now, you might argue, and in fact, if you're American and watching this, you might passionately argue that somebody in America should do that, but no one's going to at this stage. The International Court of Justice has no power to serve Benjamin Netanyahu with an arrest warrant and actually stand a chance of arresting him. Because if US imperialism stands behind you, you are immune to consequences. And nobody else is going to arrest these guys, are there? Chances are, when this war in Gaza is brought to a close one way or the other, Netanyahu will probably then, shortly afterwards, retire and head to the United States and live out his days in disgrace over there, but in a well-remunerated retirement. That will probably make all of you feel very sick to think of that, but that is the unfortunate reality of the still existing power of US imperialism. So international law, to go back to it now, is there any circumstance under which it is useful? Now, it is useful to use it to make arguments or support arguments. So if our opponents, the imperialists, rely upon, as they do shamelessly, the idea of being defenders of human rights, international law, rules-based international order, whatever the hell they want to call it this week, if that's what they want, if that's what they're going to do, then it can be useful to throw arguments of a similar kind back to them. So, for instance, when they say that armed resistance is always terrible, is always illegal. Now, of course, they don't believe that for a second, because when it comes to armed uprisings against governments they don't like, and they have the people doing the armed uprising on their payroll, that's fine. So armed uprising against the government in Syria, that's fine. Armed uprising against Israel, no, that's criminal, that's illegal, that's terrorism. And here, I mean, it's such a blatant and obvious double standard now, you would have to be blind not to see it. But to go back to the international law point, it can be useful to use various different precedents that have been set or resolutions that have been passed in the UN, because it's useful for in rhetorical terms, in terms of making arguments to people in the language the imperialists use themselves, to use arguments based on UN resolutions. So, for instance, the arguments about the rights to armed resistance. Now, it was found, according to a resolution in the UN General Assembly, I think it was related to armed resistance to occupation in, I think it was Namibia in the early 80s. There was a UN General Assembly resolution passed that found that armed resistance to occupation was legitimate. Now, of course, that has no power. You can't go, if you were arrested by the British state, as people have been, and charged with terrorism for supporting armed resistance, as people have been, and you were going to bring in a UN resolution to say that, according to the UN General Assembly, this was a legitimate act of resistance against occupation. Well, that might be quite useful, because you would then try to force the British government to try and basically make its arguments, though it would, of course, be equally useful to argue that the British government has contradicted its own stance by its enthusiastic support for terrorism in Syria. But to use these international law and UN General Assembly resolutions, it can be quite useful, as I say, when making arguments against the imperialists in language that they themselves use. However, one should never think that making arguments which reveal the imperialists' hypocrisy and reveals their emptiness and reveals the fact that they don't take any of this seriously in the slightest, if it ever impinges even slightly on their interests. When doing that for the purposes of propaganda, really, one should never be lured into the trap of thinking that any of this can ever be enforced under the current system. Like, when you have an imperialist system and one dominant imperialist power, not only can it do whatever it likes, because no one at this stage is going to directly intervene against them to stop them. The only place they've been intervened against in recent years directly, in terms of an armed force directly fighting an armed force sponsored by imperialism, Syria to an extent, but the big one is, of course, Ukraine, where a US puppet regime, a US neo-colonial regime headed by Zelensky, is being directly destroyed by the Russians. And you have certainly a significant, maybe small, but significant number of personnel from the imperialist bloc have been sent there and have died there. So that's the only real place. Those are the only real places where imperialism has been actually confronted directly by armed force, and this, of course, has caused them to have pause for thought, and certainly in Ukraine. It's not the arguments of international law that have got in the way there, but the armed force of another powerful state. In this case, of course, Russia. But the to finally answer this one, international law hasn't seriously restricted the operations of U.S. imperialism at any time they really wanted to do something. Didn't really stop them. In fact, it most definitely didn't stop them when it comes to smaller things like the invasion of Panama or the invasion of Grenada. And then when it came to the targeting of Iraq after 1991, not only did they get a UN resolution to attack Iraq in the Gulf War of that year, shamefully with the collaboration of the dying Gorbachev leadership in the Soviet Union, but they also got the UN Security Council on their side to run the starvation sanctions against Iraq. We should remember that the starvation sanctions that they ultimately used on Syria, a lot of that, the methods that they learnt to apply initially came from their long-term, decade-long siege of Iraq, with similarly devastating consequences. So, at certain points, they've got the UN framework completely on their side, and they've got. So, does that mean then that because the United Nations sponsored, allowed a resolution to go through its Security Council, stating that the actions taken by the US and its allies in 1991 against the Ba'athist government of Iraq, because that was declared to be just by a UN Security Council resolution, does that mean that their actions there are to be excused? No, of course it doesn't. This is still an imperialist war, no matter what legal flummery is engaged in about it. But as I said, like for making points in the imperialists' own language, turning their own arguments back against them, it can be useful. For actually restricting the operations of US imperialism, no, it's not useful in the slightest, and never will be either. The only thing that will ultimately defeat US imperialism is the force of those who it is organized force of those who it's trying to subjugate, successfully resisting them, or ultimately the force of the US proletariat sweeping away the ruling class. Those are the only two ways they're actually going to be stopped. International law, international public opinion, all these things can be useful at various points in a struggle, but as to stopping them, no. When it comes down to it, force decides. So, next question comes in from Red Chilean on Twitter or X, who asks the following: how come do the true believers of their jihad not turn on them now? This is with a reference to Syria. If you're a religious warrior with a country as a home base, how do you justify not turning the sights on Israel in defense of Palestine? So this is in reference, of course, to the fact that HTS is nominally a politically motivated Islamic-based organization. Of course, that's its branding. In reality, it's an operation run and organized by Turkish military intelligence, and it operates essentially as a outsourced mercenary army run by the Turks on behalf of US imperialism. Now, to go to the basis of the Red Chilean's question, the people who make up HTS and the other various different organizations which proclaim that they are jihadist organizations engaging in the great struggle for on behalf of Allah himself, on behalf of the Prophet Muhammad, on behalf of the way of life that is endorsed by the Quran and maybe the Hadith as well. How do you justify yourself if you're directly or indirectly aided by or you're aiding Israel in particular? Now, Getting inside the minds of the men in HTS, of course, is something I can't do, but I can make some educated guesses. So if you're engaged in a religious war, if you're somebody who's fought for ISIS or Al Qaeda or something like that, and you're being led against the secular nationalist forces of the former Syrian government led by Bashar al-Assad, how do those people view it? Well, I'm going to take a guess at this and say that for some of them, they are just mercenaries. They are just men who will go and fight for big money for the US imperialists. So that will be some of them. Now, others will have a religious justification, as Red Chilean indicates in his question. Now, there'll be some who will be also mercenaries, but will have their various justifications. They'll be getting their, $2,000 a day or whatever it was, that they were getting big money to fight for HTS. And they'll also have a series of quotes from the Quran lined up to justify what they're doing. And that, of course, makes their consciences easier to bear. And now there'll be some justifications for this amongst those who are doing the fighting. And you'll hear it from their supporters in the West as well, that, oh, well, we had to get rid of Assad first because he was a greater evil even than Israel or even than the US, or he was suppressing the Muslims. You've heard all of these justifications. Or for those who are a little bit more sophisticated and like a more theologically consistent line of argument, there's the arguments made by Saudi state religious ideologists who will argue that, yes, brothers, it is true. We must confront the Israelis and we must confront the Americans. But before we can do that, brothers, we must confront the evils within. Before we can confront the forces of Zionism and the forces of US imperialism, we must first purge our own ranks of traitors and devil worshippers. We must strengthen the Ummah by cleansing it of those who would see us take the wrong path. Only once the Ummah has been cleansed completely and unified behind one true interpretation, the one true way of Islam, which I represent, nobody else, can we hope to conquer the forces of the Zionists and the Americans and drive them from the Muslim lands. But we must first get our own house in order. And for that reason, the priority is getting rid of the communists, getting rid of the socialists, getting rid of the nationalists, then taking on the Shia, then taking on all the different other variations of Islam we don't like. And once we've done that, it might take 100 years, might take 200, but trust me, once we've done it, then we'll really show the enemies of Islam what's what. And I'm sure you can go and find 10, 20, 100 scholars paid for by the Saudi state or the UAE or any of the other comprador states who will tell you roughly that, yes, we will take on the enemies of Islam, but there are even deadlier enemies than the Americans and the Jews. It must be first that we take on all of the internal enemies, defeat them, then we can go off and fight the external enemy. If you want a theological justification for something, and you're Muslim or Christian or Jewish or whatever religion you want to, or Hindu, whatever religion you want to pick, you can go into the holy books of that particular religion, and a skilled propagandist can pick out a series of quotes from the Quran, from the Bible, from the Torah, from the Bhagavad Gita, from the Upanishads, name your text of choice, that will justify killing people on you supposedly who are of your own faith, working with or alongside US imperialism. We're tricking them, brothers. We're lulling them into a false sense of security. We will strike a blow against them that they will never recover from once we've worked with them for a little bit longer. Is the money in yet? Let's carry on. I'm jesting slightly, but this is how it will go. You find a bunch of quotes that sound really militant, that justify your collaboration with US imperialism and with Israel, and you sell that to people. And there'll be some in the ranks of HTS, Al Qaeda, and others who do genuinely believe that. Just as there are those in the ranks of the fascist organizations inside Ukraine who, even though what they are doing is clearly and obviously hollowing out Ukraine on behalf of US imperialism, will believe in the batshit crazy, like Ukrainian nationalist position. Nationalist should be in inverted commas there. That yes, I mean it's the same thing, often with the same enemies named. Yes, say the Banderists. Yes, we will one day sweep away the Jewish influence. We will one day also free ourselves from the corrupt and contemptible Americans. But before that, brothers, we must work with them to take on the even greater enemy, which is the Russians, which is the communists, which is insert all the different enemies of US imperialism here. And once we've won that battle, brothers, we can then turn on the Jewish influence, we can turn on the US influence, etc., etc., etc. Roughly the same justification, just, replace references to Allah and the Prophet Muhammad with, the ghost of Stepan Bandera and Shoikovich. These people always have their justifications. And so there'll be people inside the ranks of the Banderists who, some of them will be there for money, quite a lot of them. Some of them will be there for a combination of money and strange beliefs, and some of them may well be there because they are ideologically motivated, and also that they are socially bonded together in these units which have been doing this fighting. And look to any mercenary army that is motivated by a supposed ideology, which fights on behalf of US imperialism, which scoops up people who are from the propertyless masses, who are ultimately acting against their own class interests. They'll always have a justification. There'll always be some kind of ideology there, ultimately, especially if it's a movement drawn from the propertyless masses or which recruits from them, which will have its system of beliefs which it seeks to propagate amongst its ranks to bond them together. And there will be those who do believe it. Now, I would also say that, the jihad means, to go back to the question, various different things. Again, like if you consider yourself a religious warrior, there'll be those, as I said, who will come along and say, yes, we'll drive the Americans and the Zionists out, but we can only do that once we've cleansed the ranks of Islam, once we've unified ourselves, got rid of the rogue elements that are weakening us. It's very easy to do that. You're a skilled enough hack, you can dive into the Quran and, as I said, find all your quotes to justify your position that strangely always dovetail with the needs of US imperialism, but you can always find justifications for that. And the point about this is that we should look beyond the form and to the content at all times. When you look at like Al Qaeda or ISIS and waving the black flag, people go babbling on about various different religious justifications. Again, look at the form, but then move beyond that and analyze the content. And what is the content of the actual struggle these people are waging? So all the people waging these various different struggles, these various different elements who are waging the war or were waging the war on the Syrian government, who are they, for a start? Who are they really? Beyond the flags, beyond the rhetoric, beyond the scary videos, who are they really? And you find, once you start digging into it, as Max Blumenthal, Vanessa Beeley, Eva Bartlett, and others did do a decade ago when they all were writing about this. Well, Beeley and Bartlett were first to give credit where credit is due. Blumenthal came later. They all started digging into who these people actually were. So what was the actual content of these characters in terms of what the forces that were backing them, the forces that they were really fighting for, and dug it up pretty quickly that beyond all the religious justifications, these guys were just foot soldiers of US imperialism and had been for a long time. So, yeah, you can wind yourself up into a frenzy believing that you're, wielding the sword of God. But again, look at who benefits from your many, many crimes and who benefits from the ultimate result you've achieved. And the answer is US imperialism, an imperialism which is far more powerful than the proxies they employ, and is always careful to make sure that its proxies can be crushed by them or eliminated by them at any time. You'll have heard on my co-presenter of the Decline and Fall series, Kit Clarenberg, talk about how the US imperialists had a load of Al-Qaeda guys who worked for them in Bosnia whacked, causing some problems between them and their former servant, them and their servants. But this was all patched up, and they were working together again before too long. because a lot of these networks and organizations can't survive without the financing brought to them by imperialism and by imperialism's key allies. In this case, the case of the supposedly fundamentalist organizations. This is the money that comes not just via the US, but via the Gulf states and Saudi Arabia. And they can't survive without that. They can't fight without that. So they ultimately, US imperialism has the power of life and political life and death over them, or very real power over actual life and death over them. So to conclude on this question, you can find all manner of people justifying their actions in all manner of ways. But as communists, it's our duty to look at the content, into the class content of their struggle, and expose it, particularly if it is, of course, a reactionary pro-imperialist content that they are powered by. Whereas if you make a comparison, like the men who fight for Ansar Allah, the men who fight for Hezbollah, the men who have fought in Gaza, a lot of them will have religious justifications. But again, look, if you get twitchy about religious justifications, well, first of all, we shouldn't be judging just on those standards. Again, look beyond the form to the content. The content of the struggle waged by Hezbollah is objectively a progressive one, because it's one that, for all the fact that it is justified in part by religion, it is a manifestly progressive struggle against, as Hassan Nasrallah, the late Hassan Nasrallah, put it all the time, it's a struggle for the liberation of Lebanon and the whole region from the influence of US imperialism. That might be justified by references to Allah, by references to various religious texts, but ultimately, you can't hide the fact that it's a struggle for national liberation. Same is true in Yemen, same is true in Palestine. So whether something is cloaked in religious garb or justified via reference to religious texts is not the sole criterion by which we should judge anything. As I said, you can, if you're a skilled enough propagandist, you can go into a holy book and find propaganda for almost anything, find reasons to do almost anything. That is not the question. The question is what content what class content is there in the struggle? What forces does the struggle truly represent? And the struggle for national liberation in West Asia is clearly a progressive struggle. Because it is directly engaging in a battle against the forces of US imperialism, which is the primary contradiction, because it is the most horrific reactionary force in the world that is a barrier to all human progress in many different areas of the world. So any struggle waged against that has a progressive content within it, whether the people who are waging it think of themselves that way or not. So, for instance, let's go to a much more controversial example: the Taliban in Afghanistan, a collection of reactionaries, has to be said, but the eviction of US imperialism and its allies from Afghanistan is manifestly a progressive event. There's no doubt about that. Dismantling the power of US imperialism has led to a much more progressive outcome, because now you actually have real economic development starting to happen in Afghanistan, which didn't happen for 20 years under the imperialists. They had no interest in doing it. And so now the British imperialists have panicked because the Chinese and the Russians are investing in Afghanistan and trying to worm their way back in there, having totally failed to do anything progressive in their occupation of Afghanistan for 20 years. So the struggle waged by the Taliban, a collection of reactionaries in its leadership, a collection of backward-looking theocrats in many respects, but a progressive struggle. Why? Because it engaged with and ultimately defeated the primary contradiction facing the entire world, which is decaying US imperialism. And so this is how we need to look at all of these struggles and decide what content each, and look at the content they have before we can judge whether we should regard these as progressive struggles or not. And when it comes to the question of like what do people believe, well, again, like we can sometimes fall into the trap of trying to get hung up on people's motives. People's motives can be all kinds of things. I mean, is it the case, for instance, that all of the people who were charged with collaboration or aiding the fascists in the trials in the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the purges. Is it the case that every single one of them had been directly in the pay of the Nazis and the Italian fascists and the British imperialists? Not for all of them, no. But was it the case that they were part of an underground network that was, objectively speaking, aiding the fascists, aiding the class enemies? Yes. So somebody can be motivated by all kinds of reasons. They can be motivated. They could have sincerely, some of those underground guys who were carrying out acts of sabotage in the Soviet Union in the 30s, which again, this is all stuff that's been proved. Some of them might have believed quite sincerely that they were engaging in the battle to free the Soviet Union from the evils of bureaucratic dictatorial rule, as eponymized in the figure of Stalin, as personified in the figure of Stalin. So they could think quite sincerely that they're engaging in a real struggle to free the Soviet working class from this awful tyranny. But of course, this is not an endlessly subjective debate. This is something which we can test who is right and who is wrong. And somebody can be very sincerely struggling for something, and the content of their struggle is completely reactionary. So the content of the struggle of the Trotskyites in the 30s and right up to today, in that struggle that they wage, many of them are completely sincere. They consider themselves to be sincere communists, real communists, as they will tell you endlessly, as I used to say endlessly, real communists struggling against the evil bureaucratic dictatorship which is barring the way to real socialism. Many of them will believe that they are strengthening the struggle for real socialism. Some of them are, of course, just paid agents of the state. Some of them are people who have found it very convenient to adopt this objectively pro-imperialist line. Others have a sincere belief in what they're doing. Doesn't make them any less wrong. Doesn't make them any less reactionary. It would affect how we would address this to them, how we would seek to appeal to those who are sincere in their beliefs, but it doesn't make them any less dangerous. If you're in a life and death struggle with imperialism and you've got people on your behind your lines, traitors and saboteurs who are motivated by sincere beliefs, doesn't matter. They're still as dangerous as a mercenary. Perhaps they're even more dangerous, because a mercenary will not be as clever in his in the disguising of himself. So to go back to Red Chilean's question, somebody can have all kinds of beliefs that are very sincere. Maybe some of these HTS guys quite sincerely believe what their leaders, who aren't sincere because they ultimately work for Turkish intelligence and they work ultimately for US imperialism, they sincerely believe what they are told, that they're going to be marching on Jerusalem any time now, brothers, any day now. Just got to defeat these deviants and these heretics first, then we'll go there. Trust me. But their sincerity only affects how one would seek to address them, in terms of, would there be any chance of winning any of these people over? But their sincerity doesn't affect the damage that they do. Their sincerity doesn't affect the need to struggle against them. Someone can be very, very sincere and very, very wrong and be fighting for an objectively reactionary and dangerous cause. And that is what we must bear in mind. Okay, so final point today that I wanted to address, and I have put out a post on Telegram and on X about this, which is what I'm going to call is, quite frankly, an embarrassing piss fit that has been engaged in by some people who I will not name over the. You can find out who, you will guess who this refers to by just reading their stuff. You can judge their words by their own actions, but the dooming and the hysteria and the blame game that has been indulged in by certain, or shall we say, vocal enthusiasts of multipolarism since the fall of the Syrian government, and the finger pointing done by some of them, saying, "Oh, the Syrians, they've let themselves down. Well, I don't care about these people anymore. They have betrayed everything I believe in. I believed in their cause, and I feel let down." You've seen some people sincerely saying that. I'm not bothering to report on them anymore because they have betrayed themselves, or I'm not bothering with the Arabs anymore. Thank you, Mr. Galloway, for that one. Or this region can't be civilized. They'll always fight each other. They'll always fall into sectarianism. All this guff that these people have been spouting for the last few days. This must be addressed. And let's first of all, are these people who are engaging in this endless piss fit, especially those who, of course, sit in the West and complain from an armchair, complain and pointing a finger at people who have been doing fighting and dying in Syria against the forces backed by imperialism for many, many years. Those people really need to wind their fucking necks in. Now, people who are actually in the region and who have put their necks on the line reporting from the region, they're a different story. Those are people who have risked something in this struggle. But people in the West, in particular, the multipolar advocates who have gone from saying America is defeated, Putin has won, grand chess move, destroys imperialism, to saying it's all over, everything's fucked, damn those Arabs. Well, those people really need to shut the hell up. Because what you have done here, those of you who have engaged in this hysterical piss fit, is essentially reveal yourselves as being deeply unserious individuals, because you are not considering who bears the primary responsibility for what has happened in Syria. The primary responsibility for what has happened in Syria does not belong to the Syrians themselves. It does not belong to the Russians or the Iranians. It does not belong to even the Arab comprador regimes, of whom more later. The responsibility starts with imperialism. It starts with US, British, French, and German imperialism, and it starts, by extension, with those who failed to act against it. The so-called anti-war movements in Britain and the United States, who not only failed to mount any kind of serious opposition against the regime change war in Libya, but also repeated their errors and repeated their neglect and repeated their treachery over Syria, who fell for every single lie that the imperialists told, who repeated all the propaganda about how it was just a legitimate revolt against the Assad regime, and it was an evil regime, and therefore the revolt itself couldn't be questioned. But then this is what the British anti-war movement did. But we shouldn't have bombing. They did what they've always done. They wring their hands. They agree with all the propaganda put out there about the designated enemy of the day from imperialism. And then at the last minute, they say, oh, but we shouldn't have any bombing, having reinforced all the propaganda from imperialism. And they did nothing to stop the bombing campaign, and the bombing campaigns that were waged by US imperialism. They did nothing to stop or even vaguely go anywhere near threatening the imposition of the siege warfare methods of US imperialism on Syria. And they let this repulsive situation continue uninterrupted for 13 years, never mounting any serious opposition campaigns, never actually seriously questioning the propaganda. And those that did, like the aforementioned journalists, like Bealey, like Bartlett, like Blumenthal, who did report the truth about what US imperialism was up to and who its allies were in Syria, those people were marginalized and demonized, particularly by the Western left. So if you are in the West and you want to look for responsibility as to what has happened here, well, look no further than your own doorstep. That's where the responsibility lies. It lies with those who pretend to be anti-war voices, but who in actual fact are not. They are those who pretend to be against wars, those who pretend to be opponents of the establishment, like our old friend Owen Jones, but who are in fact the most enthusiastic proponents for imperialism. That's where the responsibility lies. It's the responsibility of those of us in the imperial core to mount more serious anti-imperialist campaigns inside the imperial core nations. That's where the responsibility lies. It lies with us. These are actions which originate from Washington, London, Paris, and Berlin, and a few other places too. They then act through their regional compradors and collaborationists. But it all starts here. So the power to stop it also it resides here. It's just that these so-called anti-war movements have been under the leadership of pro-Labour Party, or in the US, pro-Democratic Party hacks for such a long time that they've been rendered completely ineffectual. So if you're mad about any of this, and don't go around pointing fingers at Russia, Iran, Syria, or, the Arabs as a whole, look to your own back door. Look to actions that we could have taken ourselves. And I include myself in this. In my analysis of this, was appalling and under the influence of Trotskyism up until around about 2018, 2019, when I started to change. I started to revise my opinion. Reading Max Blumenthal's book in 2020 was a big part of that. And it revealed a certain truth to me. But don't go around blaming everybody else. Criticize ourselves first. Criticize what goes on in your own country. Criticize the manifest failure and treachery of the left in our own countries. That's where you should start pointing the fingers, because that's where we can actually have the most impact. And I'll come back to what I was saying the other day. Stop acting as if this was some kind of fucking spectator sport and you are sat on the sidelines cheering on a team, and then you have a piss fit because your team doesn't win, and you're disappointed in people you have emotionally invested in from afar. This isn't fucking sports. This isn't the Premier League. This isn't the NFL. This is a real and bitter and blood-soaked struggle waged by bloodthirsty imperialists. But of course, taking that seriously and waging a serious struggle against their war machine at home comes with risks. Comes with risk of arrest, comes with the risk of demonization, comes with the risks that have been run by the people like the Palestine Action People. But let's get over this. If we want to stop the wars that are waged by US imperialism, you have to dismantle the machinery that US imperialism relies on, and that includes NATO, it includes the EU, it includes of course ending the US military occupation of many of the European nations, including Britain. That's the work that you need to get started on, not this finger pointing and acting as if this was like the aftermath of a game that your team's lost. Get over yourselves and start doing serious work, and start admitting to ourselves that our biggest problem lies at home, not anywhere else. And with that, I'll conclude the program for today. Thanks everybody for tuning in. Come back tomorrow, where we'll be doing a live stream again on the probably going to be covering the events in Ukraine, because things are escalating there again, and the Russian advance is continuing apace. So we'll be back with that tomorrow. Thanks to everybody who supports the show on Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee, and I will be back with you again tomorrow.
주체의 사회 주리를 우리 어떻게 성대로 지키는가를 세계여 보라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님 백승의 영도 따라서 선군의 붉은 기 그 신념으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 주체의 강성애국을 우리 어떻게 이 땅에 세우는가를 새기려거라. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 장군님의 뜻을 받들어 불굴의 정신력 그대 장으로 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은 한다면 한다. 조선은 결심하면 한다. 조선은